Paris, the 1920s. A city reborn after the Great War, where lights never dimmed, jazz never stopped, and freedom felt endless. Writers filled the cafes. Artists painted the future. Dancers lit up the cabarets. But behind the laughter, behind the champagne and the music, a darker story was unfolding. A new drug had arrived, promised as safe, sold as glamorous, embraced as fashionable. It was called heroin. At first, it was a whisper among artists and aristocrats. Soon, it became the heartbeat of the nightlife. And then, it became an epidemic that tore Paris apart. This is not just a story about a drug. It's a story about dreams and destruction, about a generation chasing escape and finding ruin. Tonight, we travel back 100 years to uncover the forgotten truth of a city that danced with fire. This is the heroin craze of 1920s Paris. The heroin craze of 1920s Paris. 1. Paris awakens from the war sound of distant jazz saxophone, faint laughter of a Paris cafe. Fade in. Paris. The year is 1920. The Great War has ended. The guns are silent. The world is wounded but alive. And in Paris, the city of light, something extraordinary is happening. The boulevards are crowded with artists, writers, dancers, and dreamers. Cafes buzz with conversation. Jazz bands fill the smoky nightclubs. Young women in short skirts and bobbed hair, the new flappers, dance until dawn. It is the beginning of what history will call Les Années Folles, the crazy years. But hidden behind the glamour, Paris is also playing host to something darker. A substance that arrived in the city as medicine, but became a fashionable poison. That substance was heroin. The miracle drug, heroin, did not begin its life in a Paris nightclub. It began in a German laboratory in 1898. The German pharmaceutical company Bayer introduced a new drug, a white powder derived from morphine. They called it heroin. At first, it was a miracle. Doctors prescribed it for coughs, pain, anxiety, even for restless children. Pharmacies sold it in neat little bottles, no prescription needed. Advertisements promised a safe, non-addictive alternative to morphine. Yes, they truly believed it. In the early 1900s, no one understood how powerfully addictive heroin really was. Soon, it spread across Europe. In France, chemists and doctors handed it out freely. Soldiers returning from World War I, injured and in pain, were given heroin to numb their wounds. And Paris, scarred from 4 years of war, welcomed anything that could take away pain. But heroin was more than a medicine. It was a thrill, a new escape. And in the 1920s, escape was exactly what Paris was looking for. A city hungry for escape. After the war, France was a land of ghosts. 1. 4 million French soldiers were dead. Millions more were wounded, broken, or traumatized. But Paris refused to mourn forever. Instead, the city threw itself into life with a feverish intensity. This was the Paris of Montmartre and Pigalle, of cabarets like the Moulin Rouge and the Folies Bergère, of smoky cafes in Saint-Germain-des-Prés, where poets scribbled verses by candlelight, of American jazz musicians bringing new rhythms from Harlem. Every night, the streets of Paris pulsed with music, champagne, and freedom. But with freedom came something else: experimentation. People tried new fashions, new dances, new loves, and new drugs, and none was more fashionable than heroin. The arrival of the craze in the early 1920s, heroin began appearing in Paris nightclubs. At first, it was whispered about only in bohemian circles, artists, musicians, writers, but soon it spread to the wealthy. Young women in pearls and silk carried little packets of powder in their purses. Jazz musicians used it to stay awake through long nights. Writers claimed it opened the doors of imagination. For the Paris elite, heroin was not seen as dangerous. It was chic, exotic, the latest thrill. As one French newspaper put it in 1923, heroin is not the vice of the poor. It is the secret of the fashionable. But behind the glamour, the truth was far more sinister, because heroin does not stay a secret for long. Once it grips you, it never lets go. This is the story of the heroin craze of 1920s Paris, a story of beauty and destruction, freedom and addiction, art and tragedy. And it all begins here. 2. Parisian nightlife and the Craze. Montmartre, Pigalle, Saint-Germain. These districts come alive with music, laughter, and the sound of champagne corks exploding. This is the Paris of the Roaring Twenties, a world of endless nights, a playground for artists, dreamers, and anyone bold enough to escape the ordinary. The cabaret world. At the center of this nightlife were the cabarets, the Moulin Rouge, the Folies Bergère, the Casino de Paris. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and perfume. Dancers in glittering costumes performed the can-can. Jazz bands from America played wild new rhythms, fast, free, and intoxicating. The audience, a mix of everyone. Wealthy aristocrats sitting beside struggling artists. Foreign tourists beside French poets. Flappers in short skirts beside soldiers still wearing their medals. And in the shadows, passed from hand to hand, was the new obsession. A little packet of white powder. Heroin. The flapper and the needle. Women played a crucial role in the heroin craze. The 1920s were the first decade of the modern woman in Paris. Flappers, with bobbed hair, lipstick, short dresses, and cigarettes, defied every old rule of society. For them, heroin was more than a drug. It was a statement, a symbol of rebellion, a glamorous accessory. Some women carried tiny silver syringes hidden in their purses, as casually as carrying a mirror or lipstick. Others would sprinkle powder into drinks at parties. In magazines, heroin was described as the chic escape of the Parisienne. It became part of the image of the flapper, independent, modern, untouchable. But behind the glitter, the reality was cruel. For many of these young women, heroin quickly turned from symbol of freedom to chains of addiction. The jazz connection. Music was the heartbeat of 1920s Paris. And nothing symbolized this more than jazz. After World War I, hundreds of African American musicians came to Paris. They brought the sound of Harlem, trumpets, saxophones, drums, and Parisians fell in love. Night after night, jazz clubs like Le Grand Duc and Bricktops filled with crowds. The rhythm was wild, free, and new, just like the spirit of the decade. But for many musicians, the long nights were exhausting, and heroin became the fuel that kept them playing. Some believed it sharpened their senses. Others said it gave them energy and inspiration. But slowly, it claimed their bodies and their music. Behind the shining brass instruments, the smoky spotlight, and the applause, there was a darkness. Heroin was playing its own song in Paris. High society joins in it. Wasn't just the artists and musicians. By 1924, heroin had made its way into Paris's high society. In glittering salons along the Boulevard Haussmann, aristocrats whispered about La Poudre Blanche. Wealthy men shared it at private dinners. Fashionable women used it between glasses of champagne. For the rich, heroin was not a drug for the desperate. It was a luxury, a way of showing sophistication. A French columnist in 1925 wrote, "To refuse heroin at a party is to refuse Paris itself." And so, the craze spread, from smoky nightclubs to the most elegant drawing rooms of the city. The Streets respond, but while the wealthy used heroin as a luxury, the poor used it as an escape. In the back alleys of Pagao, addicts huddled in corners. The same powder that glittered in golden salons destroyed lives in the shadows. For them, heroin was not glamorous. It was survival, a few moments of warmth in a world still haunted by war and poverty. And as more and more Parisians fell under its spell, the city began to change. The nightlife glittered brighter than ever, but beneath it all, a darker current was flowing. By the mid-1920s, heroin was everywhere in Paris. From cabarets to cafes, from flappers to aristocrats, from musicians to beggars. It was not just a drug, it was a symbol, a secret, a craze. But soon, Paris would discover the true cost of its obsession, because heroin did not simply create a fashionable thrill. It created an epidemic, and the City of Light was about to confront its darkest shadow. By 1925, heroin was no longer just a secret of cabarets and salons. It had spread into the bloodstream of Paris itself, from the grand boulevards to the narrow alleys, from the sparkling cafes to the dim boarding houses. Heroin was everywhere, and Paris was beginning to feel the cost. Fashionable poison. In the early years of the craze, heroin was dressed in glamour. Advertisements still called it harmless. Writers described it as exotic, even romantic. Magazines whispered about actresses and flappers using it as part of their charm. It became a fashionable accessory, like lipstick, like pearls, like champagne. High society women would gather in their salons, dressed in silk gowns, and casually pass around syringes as though they were sharing perfume. At elite parties, heroin was served alongside cigars and fine wine. To refuse it was almost impolite. To use it was daring, chic, modern. But this fashion had a cruel cost. Behind the glittering image of the Parisienne, addict was a darker reality. Collapsed veins, ruined health, secret suffering. The fashion of heroin was spreading, and it was dragging Paris with it. The poor and the working class, but heroin did not stop with the wealthy. In the working class neighborhoods, Belleville, Pigalle, Montmartre, the drug became an escape from hardship. For men who had returned from the Great War with wounds and trauma, heroin promised relief. For women struggling to feed families in a city scarred by inflation, it promised forgetfulness. For the young and restless, it promised adventure, but the promises were lies. Addicts pawned their belongings to buy more. Some turned to prostitution, others to theft. The police noted a rise in street crime tied to drugs. A city once known for its beauty was now filled with whispers of danger. By 1926, journalists were warning of a hidden plague spreading through the streets of Paris. And still, the nightlife glittered. Heroin and the youth. No group was more vulnerable than the youth. For young Parisians, born in the shadow of war, now began to see the truth. Heroin was not inspiring art, it was destroying it. The city turns uneasy. By 1928, Paris was uneasy. The craze that had once seemed fashionable was now impossible to hide. Overdoses filled hospitals. Crime filled police reports. The laughter of cabarets was shadowed by whispers of fear. The city that had embraced heroin as a symbol of freedom now realized it had chained itself to poison. And change was coming, because soon the government would no longer look away. The world itself would no longer look away. Paris was about to face its reckoning. By the end of the 1920s, Paris could no longer pretend. What began as a fashion trend had turned into a national crisis. Heroin was no longer just a whisper in cabarets. It was on the streets, in the homes, and in the headlines. And so, the government finally stepped in. The first alarms doctors were the first to raise the alarm. Medical journals in France began publishing shocking reports. Cases of collapsed lungs, nervous breakdowns, and sudden deaths, all linked to heroin. One Parisian doctor wrote in 1927, "Heroin addiction spreads faster than syphilis and destroys the mind faster than alcohol." For the first time, the government could not ignore the evidence. The so-called safe drug was revealed to be anything but safe. Laws and restrictions. In 1925, France officially began restricting the sale of heroin. Pharmacies could no longer sell it openly. Doctors were warned not to prescribe it, but these laws were weak, and the black market was strong. Dealers smuggled heroin into Paris through ports, hidden in shipments of coffee and wine. Some factories, still licensed to make morphine, secretly diverted supplies into heroin production. By 1927, the French government realized the epidemic could not be stopped with half measures. Stronger laws were passed. Police raids targeted cabarets and dance halls. Addicts were arrested alongside dealers. Paris was entering an era of crackdown, the international stage. But this was not just Paris's problem. Across Europe and America, heroin addiction was spreading. In New York, London, and Berlin, similar stories filled the newspapers. The League of Nations, the world's first international organization, began holding conferences on the drug menace. For the first time in history, heroin was declared a threat to global health. In 1928, France signed international agreements to control the production and distribution of narcotics. Factories were placed under strict surveillance. Exports were monitored, and heroin, once praised as modern medicine, was officially condemned. The police fight back. In Paris itself, the police fought a daily war. Raids became common in Pigalle and Montmartre. Nightclubs were shut down. Dealers were dragged into courtrooms. Newspaper headlines celebrated each arrest, calling it a victory in the war against poison. But it was not so simple. For every dealer caught, 2 more appeared. For every addict arrested, dozens more slipped through the cracks. The crackdown was loud, but addiction was quiet and relentless. Public opinion shifts. Still, the tide was turning. The public, once fascinated by the glamour of heroin, now recoiled in fear. Parents warned their children to stay away from the dance halls. Newspapers printed cautionary tales of young lives destroyed. Cartoons mocked heroin users as pathetic figures, no longer elegant but tragic. Paris began to see heroin not as freedom, but as slavery, the price of control. Yet even with laws, raids, and international agreements, the damage was already done. Thousands were addicted, hundreds had died, and countless families had been broken. Heroin had left scars that no law could erase. One French senator remarked in 1929, "We are closing the stable. Doors after the horses have already fled." It was true. Paris had waited too long to act. And while the crackdown slowed the spread, it could not undo the decade of destruction. The heroin craze of 1920s, Paris was coming to an end. But the story was not over. Because even as the government fought to control the drug, a deeper question remained. Why had Paris embraced heroin in the first place? And what did it say about a society searching for escape in the shadows of war and modernity?